Ago, we would stare at these analog clocks on the wall and guess whether or not it was exactly 10 o'clock. Now I'm staring at this digital image tacked to a satellite telling me whether it's 10 o'clock or not. But anyway, great to see everybody this morning. It is 10 o'clock and time for us to start our Bible study this morning. We're in this series of studies about a more excellent way that Paul speaks about, right? He talked about some things that the Corinthian church had been pursuing in chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians. Then by the time you get to chapter 13, he begins to talk about a more excellent way, a better way and approach towards examining various things. So we've been working through that, and what we're trying to do specifically is apply these principles of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 to the subject of love as God defines it, and we've been making specific application to family situations and trying to do that in various ways, including the church, right? Because the church is a family, and we've been trying to make application across the board in very specific ways as it relates to that, and we'll pick up on that study again this morning. But if you would, before we begin, let's go to God in prayer together before we start our study. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day that you've blessed us with, the kindness that you continue to bestow upon us on a daily basis. We know that all that we have comes from your bountiful hand, that we are nothing without you, and that you care for us and love us beyond measure. Thank you for your watch care and reminding us daily that, and despite the difficulties that this world often brings, we always know the security and the comfort of you and the joy that you bring. Thank you for Jesus, who makes that possible. Thank you for his sacrifices that brought remedy and answer to the calamity of sin. And we appreciate and love so much your willingness to give him and his willingness to come to bring this salvation and hope to all of us. Strengthen us in our study, strengthen our families, help us to use your wisdom and to strengthen all of our relationships and make them stronger by using your guidance and understanding. Thank you again for all that you provide, and it's through your Son's name that we pray. Amen. So Wednesday night, I touched the hem of the garment in some ways. We were talking about what two things under this lesson out of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. What two? Patience and kindness, right? Patience and kindness as part of that definition of love, right? Love is patient and kind. And how it is that we then use patience and kindness to improve the family relationships. That's been the topic of discussion. We did that for quite a while on Wednesday, obviously. We want to continue that narrative this morning. And we were talking Wednesday before we finished up and ran out of time about the idea of how it is that patience and kindness can benefit when parents have the responsibility to do what with their children? Okay, to raise them, but in specific, to train them. And it's on the screen. I keep pointing at it, by the way. I'm trying to help you. How we discipline, right? That's the subject we're on. Patience when disciplining. It's at the bottom of your screen there. Patience when disciplining our children. And that's the point in your notes as well, outlined that we stopped on Wednesday night. And the one thing we did talk about Wednesday night was Exodus 30, verses 17 through 20. And if you looked at that on the surface, you might think, what has that got to do with anything as it relates to the family? Because what really is Exodus 30, 17 through 20 about? What's it tell us about? And I'm not... Right about this brazen altar and how they needed to wash themselves before they would go in and do these various services. But what was the point we were making from that? There's rules, right? And when there's rules, they need to be what? Obeyed. Okay, they need to be obeyed, but if you expect obedience, you've got to, you got to clearly define them, right? You got to clearly define them. What was the consequence, by the way, if you remember, we read through it and talked a little bit about it in Exodus 30, verse 17. What was the consequence if they didn't? Death. Pretty serious, right? It's pretty serious when God gave these instructions in that text. If you fail to do this, he says, you shall die. But God would not condemn somebody under such a fierce judgment if he didn't define his expectations and rules. We lose our patience sometimes and act unkindly towards our children because we have expectations that we never what? We never told them. We didn't clearly define them for our children. We expected them to just know, and we talked about that We even said, we use that phrase sometimes we say, you should have what? You should have known better. You should have known. But no. Parents, our job is to educate and to teach so that they do know better. Now, it's quite possible that I have clearly defined the rules 45,000 times, and they still what? They still break it, right? Then discipline comes, and patience and kindness still needs to be part of that process, right? But I tend to lose my patience. I tend to act unkindly sometimes in ways that really aren't fair if I haven't defined the rules. That was Wednesday's discussion. But there's more to it that I want to talk about with you. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 24, jump over to that text. Matthew chapter 23, verse 24. There's a principle that Jesus shares there that I think is important in this discussion of maintaining patience and kindness when disciplining, which is necessary with our children. He says this about whom, by the way, in this text? Who's his audience? These Pharisees, right? These Pharisees that just have all these weird rules, right? They have these traditions that they'll honor vehemently and ignore weightier matters of what God's instructions are. That's the context. But there's an interesting thought Jesus adds in verse 24. He said, you're blind guides. You strain at a what? A gnat. You swallow a camel. You ever done that when you've been disciplining your children, made a big deal out of nothing and made small deals out of big deals? Yeah, we've all probably been there, right? Where what was in front of us really was a gnat. But they got the fury and the anger and the frustration of a parent who really should have stepped back and realized this wasn't as big a deal as we were making it out to be. Generally, that happens when we're what? Okay, angry, maybe. We're maybe frustrated, overwhelmed, stressed. And by the way, all of those things may have nothing to do with whom? The child. All of those things may have nothing to do with the child. They may have everything to do with everything else we're dealing with in life. And one of the most disappointing mistakes that I'm sure I had made over the years was letting the frustrations and challenges and overwhelming nature of everything else be transmitted over to my children. Where I have strained gnats while there were camels walking around the house that I really ought to have been dealing with. Right? Jesus shares a very, I think, important principle that I think we can use. Be patient, right? Analyze this. Think about this. Consider what's in front of me. Is this, is my reaction to this really warranted? Has this situation rose to such a level that this is how I ought to be responding to this situation? Those are fair things that we need to be considering, because I don't want to be guilty of straining out a gnat while there's a much larger issue in front of me in my home that I need to be talking about or addressing. And what happens is, when I react, and I didn't briefly mention this Wednesday, when I react the same way to gnats and camels, what does that communicate to my children? That there's no difference. It communicates to my children that and they know the difference. They know the difference between a gnat and a camel. They know the difference between something that's a major issue and something that's, because I told you, right? I illustrated it, I believe, Wednesday. I said if I react the same way, if they break a lamp in the house, knock over, bump a lamp, and break that lamp, if I react the same way to that as if they broke that lamp over their sister's head, what am I teaching them? I'm teaching them that Dad doesn't know the difference between gnats and camels. Dad doesn't know the difference between how he should react. So be patient in that moment. Let love rise up in those moments where, yes, discipline may need to take place, but I'm sending messages to my children all the while in leading them to think that everything rises to the same level. And then when I really need to deal with something important because I've been straining gnats all their life, they're probably going to what? They're going to ignore me. They've learned to just tune me out because they've just seen me swatting gnats all my life. It's a challenge for us, right? And patience and kindness in this discipline process is important. I'll pause for a second. Your thoughts? I don't know what it is with y'all. You are much more talkative on Wednesdays than you are on Sunday. I don't know whether you're not getting enough sleep on Saturday nights or what it is, but you get to bed earlier. All right, anyway. But so let's add Matthew 5. There's one more thought I wanted to share with you. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7. Again, exercising patience and kindness when it comes to disciplining our children. Now, this is in the middle of what do we call these here in Matthew chapter 5? We call these beatitudes, right? These are the attitudes that Jesus teaches us here on the Sermon on the Mount that we should be focusing on. And he said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." And Jesus didn't specify in what areas he meant that for this to be applied, so I have to assume that he meant to be applied all the time, in every situation. This is the character of the followers of Jesus. Those who want to be citizens in the kingdom that Jesus is leading these people and this audience to appreciate. This is how my citizens are going to behave. I really see that as what this Sermon on the Mount is about. This is how people who come to this new nation that I'm building, this new people that we're becoming, this is what they're going to look like. This is what I'm asking of them. And he says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." You've heard me maybe talk about Deborah and I when we're raising our three, that we would have Mercy Day. And basically Mercy Day was this. It was a day that she and I were both fed up. Right? We're just fed up. I've heard Deborah say, "Children, I feel like a failure because you're not doing anything that we're asking you right now." And I know you're sitting there going, "Oh, not those children. Oh, precious things they are." They're not here today, by the way, none of them. So they're getting the full bucket load today. What's your point, Brian? My point is sometimes I can let that frustration boil over and I lose my patience and I act unkind in those days. Now, again, I'm not saying discipline never has to happen. Trust me, it happened, right? It happened. But there were days where you would say, "You know what, guys? Listen, this day has gone miserably. We've gotten off to a bad start and it hasn't seemed to stop. But we're going to stop it right now. And we're going to wipe the slate clean. And we're going to start this day all over as if none of the things that happened in the first 5 hours of the day ever did. And it's Mercy Day, we're starting over." Isn't that kind of what God does for us with His mercy through Jesus? Isn't that what His mercy's about? Start over, Brian. Let's start over. Made mistakes. You've got sins and transgressions in your life. I've given my blood to cleanse you of those sins. Let's start over. That's what God's mercy through Jesus is all about, and I can be educating my children while they're being raised to understand that even when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old. Before they can ever understand the concept of God, before they can ever understand the concept of this Creator in its fullest sense. I mean, we could teach them about God. Don't misunderstand me. When they're younger than that even, you can teach them. But when they're really struggling, when they're at an age where they can understand some of the facts, but they don't necessarily understand the meanings of all those things, but they can begin to appreciate the concept of mercy if they see it in me. And then maybe someday when they grow older and they begin to understand in greater ways the importance of Jehovah and what He really means, they would seek His mercy as well. But if they've never witnessed it, if they've never ever experienced or seen a moment of mercy being ever portrayed in front of them or being offered unto them, then I may not have an easy path trying to get them to seek God's mercy when they've never seen it before. Blessed are the merciful. Parents, sometimes we just got to stop and say, you know what? This has been disastrous. We've all made mistakes today. We're going to start over. And I'm extending mercy. And what we do when people extend to us mercy is we return grace back to them, and we start this process all over again, and we strive to work better and do better together. Now, I guarantee you there were probably days where Mercy Day was started, and 2 hours later we were still dealing with the same thing. Then they learned about justice, right? Then they learn about discipline. Then they learn, listen, you don't get to abuse mercy. You don't get to take advantage of some person's kindness. It's all part of that educational process of raising children. And when we're disciplining, patience and kindness will follow if mercy's at least part of our thinking process in certain moments. Your thoughts? You're probably, never mind. You're probably sitting thinking about all the times in your own life, right? When you're like, oop, yeah, probably shouldn't have said that. Probably could have shown some mercy there. But we're all there, by the way. We're all there. I'll come back.
Keeping your word. Sometimes we want them to do what we want them to do, but sometimes we tell them we're going to do something, and my little Lila comes and she likes to make a list of everything we're supposed to do, and if I don't get done with that list, I get in trouble.
Be honest, right? Be honest, and honor what we say.
God was the same way with the Israelites.
Yeah.
How many times that they would disobey His laws, and He would grant mercy, and then He reached a point where, okay, now it's time to deal with this.
Yeah, and I think you do. And I think you see, and a lot of times I don't think we appreciate it, but you see a lot more mercy than you do. But He does reach a point where He's like, okay, I don't know what else to do. I've sent prophet after prophet after prophet. I've given you every opportunity to turn this thing around. Now it's time for corrective measures. And so the lesson can be learned in greater ways.
Also, I think, well, I know for me, I'm wondering if Grandma told you I was going to be here this morning, but.
Something's been on the table long before today.
But I know, especially with me, sometimes I expect things out of my children I don't expect out of myself. I get frustrated and I get upset and I lash out, but they shouldn't get frustrated and upset and lash out. And it's something, if you want them to do it, you should show them by example what you want. Instead of, I'm an adult, I can react this way.
Well, I always tell people one of the coolest and one of the scariest things you ever get to witness as a parent is to watch your child become you right in front of your eyes. And it's really neat some days, right? It's really neat some days. But when I've acted angry and been loud and just, blowing steam all the time, and then my children behave angrily and blow steam all the time, and then you go, well, why are they behaving that way? And then you think, oh, they're mimicking. They're mimicking what they've seen. But if we reverse that, and kindness and patience is what they witness, my hope would be, there's nothing perfect in this world, but my hope would be that's what we would see in return, right? They're going to hopefully begin to mimic what they're witnessing in me. But there have been lots of times, all of us have had that, eye-opening moment where we're like, oh my, I'm my dad, or oh no, I'm my mother, and with never mind. But anyway, we all get it. Yeah, we all get it. Thank you. Any other thoughts before I move out of this topic? Suki? Yeah, they're going to pattern. Yeah. Yeah, they're paying a lot more attention than we realize. And if they're going to witness patience and kindness from me, then we hope that'll follow. And ultimately, you hope it'll follow them into adulthood. And they would be that kind of parent eventually, maybe, and person moving forward. Okay, let's move on in our material then and jump to the next subject matter. Now, and when I wrote this material several years ago, I wanted to touch every relationship that comes along the path in families. And I could have fit it in any number of these definitive kinds of moments within 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but it just felt right to talk a little bit about extended family here when it comes to this patience and kindness topic, and love that drives patience and kindness when you're talking about extended families. Now, I'm not going to read to you 3 chapters out of the book of Genesis. I hope that maybe you at least went back and refreshed your memory of that history. But what a train wreck that was, right? From start to finish, in many ways, Jacob and Laban's relationship was strained and troubled. Mostly because of what? They weren't, particularly Laban in this circumstance, wasn't honest. Okay? His future father-in-law, and then in some ways after he was his father-in-law, he didn't necessarily deal with Jacob in honest and fair ways. Side point, Jacob wasn't necessarily honest and upright in his life at times either. Yeah, with his own parents and circumstances, right? So it's interesting to think about that what Jacob did is now coming back to him. Now, without going into the details, there are some parts of this story I still to this day don't understand how they happen, right? I don't understand how he receives a wife and she's not the same person that he thought, and he didn't know that till later. Okay, I struggle with that, but there's apparently something cultural that allows that somehow that can happen, and we'll leave it at that. But he wanted and asked for Rachel, but he got Leah. Oh no, I'm now married to Leah. That's not what we bargained for here. I worked 7 years for you, Laban, so that I could receive Rachel as my wife. So they struck a deal. Okay, I'll give you Rachel 2, but you got to work another 7 in this process. So this whole relationship starts out bad. Then what happens? Leah starts bearing what? Children. Big cultural importance to them, right? I mean, you look at that history, and you even read Bible history, and you see how much importance was placed on heritage and extending family heritages. And it's still important, I think, to people today, but not in the same senses, right? I don't believe it to the same level as they had. They always felt like that somebody great was eventually going to come from somebody's family, and so it was very important to them. So Leah starts having children, and Rachel's not. So what's Rachel do? We've seen this before, by the way. Yeah, here's one of my servants. Here's a handmaid. Because if you, again, we may not get it, but the idea was if the handmaid that was offered bears children, they're actually Jacob and Rachel's children, right? That's the concept. And so she starts having children, the handmaid. Then ultimately more, and then Leah gets frustrated because it seems like that's her bearing. So she does what? Gives him a handmaid, right? All I'm trying to remind you of the history of is this has got problems written all over it, right? This family has problems written all over it that they've got to sort through. And they quickly, Rachel and Leah became adversarial. Jacob and Laban become adversarial. The servants of Laban and Jacob become adversarial. This situation rises up to a point where there's adversity everywhere. Yeah, it doesn't stop. And why I wanted to just get your mind thinking about that is, is in that extended family relationships that we have in this day and age. If we start out in adversarial kinds of ways, it's kind of hard to push the brakes on that, isn't it? If we start out fighting, if we start out with a lack of patience, then it's kind of hard to reverse that. Because if we start out with that lack of patience and kindness and motivated by love, on my side of this equation, right? I can't control everybody. I can't speak on their behalf. I can't force them to do anything. But I can control my behaviors. And I can act in proper ways and be patient and kind and loving on my side of this equation. But if I get into this adversarial mode, then pride kicks in later. And then it becomes all about, well, he started it, or she said this, and that's why I'm, right? And all we're doing is perpetuating what? The problem. Perpetuating it. Whereas maybe, even if I don't like what somebody said or how they behaved, or I feel like even in some ways I'm not receiving what should be rightfully provided, patience and kindness needs to come running to the forefront. Because if not, we're going to create long-term problems. 3 chapters worth that then goes even beyond that of problems when we let that become adversarial. This is what God said. It's simplistic and yet important in this conversation. In Genesis chapter 2, in verse 24, and again it's in your notes as well. But why I think this text is important, there's 2 reasons why. Number one, it's one of the earliest introductions of thoughts about God's design for marriage, right? And the other thing I think that's important about this is when Jesus was questioned about the subject of marriage in New Testament times, so in the very beginning of things, God said, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." And then when Jesus is questioned about the same kinds of issues, what's he do? He quotes this, right? He quotes what God said in the beginning. What Jesus does for us is, listen, what God established in principle at the very beginning of this process is still the same vital principle that we need to understand even in Jesus' day. And if it could last that several thousand years from start to Jesus, then certainly it can still be important to us as well. So, mother-in-laws and father-in-laws, I'm just starting to learn how to be that. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Right? The relationship changes. It changes. That child that lived in my home and ate at my table and wore the clothes that I purchased for them and had the responsibilities to respond to any of the rules and clearly defined paths that I offered unto them, they reach a point where they leave that relationship. They enter into a new relationship where they cleave to a husband or a wife, depending on, and they're now one flesh. They now have a new union that has its own entity, separate and apart from what was once tied. I don't know how good I'm going to be at getting out of the way. I don't know. It ain't going to be easy, right? Patience and kindness. That's right. That's the point I'm making. I loved this material 12 years ago when I wrote it, because I didn't have to do any of this. I didn't have to do any of it. I could tell everybody what they ought to do. And then I got my car and went back to wherever I was staying or went back home or whatever it might be. And I thought, I told them. Well, I really set them straight on that. Sure hope they listened. Because a guy who's never been a father-in-law before in his life told those who were how they ought to behave. And then all of a sudden now, here I am for the first time and looking and re-looking at this same material that I wrote 12 years ago or however long it was. And now I got to rethink it all and make some personal application. There's going to have to be a lot of patience and kindness extended to our own children as they navigate what it means to become one flesh, a new relationship. As they begin to try to appreciate what it means that they have now chosen to cleave unto their husband or their wife, and they have to deal with the responsibilities of that. And I certainly can be there to help guide. I can certainly be there to help encourage. If they have questions that I can aid them with, I'm there. But not in the same way when they were 12. And that's hard. And those of us who have children of age who are getting married or are married, then there are going to be days where you and I are going to have to be the patient and kind one in that situation. And recognize that they have their own relationship and their own family maybe that they're raising, and they've got their own responsibilities. And my connectivity to them is now different. And sometimes the children may be the problem, and the way they, because, by the way, let me back up just a little bit. Just because somebody gets married, by the way, doesn't mean they no longer have any obligations to their parents. I think the Bible's pretty clear about that. They still have obligations and responsibilities to care for and love and help take care of needs. There's still those kinds of obligations. But father-in-laws and mother-in-laws need to get out of the way sometimes and extend some mercy and extend some grace and extend some kindness and patience. And maybe if we'll do that, particularly in those early years, it may advantage us in the later years. But if we start out adversarial, I think we've already demonstrated what that does and how long that goes. And so be careful in this extended family. And let me say this. Let's just be open about this conversation. But you're also dealing with another set of in-laws on the other side that are also involved in this new connectivity. And I've witnessed that go horribly wrong. I've too often probably witnessed that where the adversarial portion of this circumstance wasn't the about to be or newly married couple and creating adversarial situations towards one or the other. It was the in-laws on both sides of that equation creating an adversarial circumstance that those stuck in the middle, the couple stuck in the middle, were trying to resolve. Now, I would encourage young men to realize, and I realize, but fair warning, don't talk about your mom's cooking in your first year of marriage. Yes, I have experience with that. Yes, I do. I asked Deborah one time when we were first married why we ate spaghetti sauce out of a jar. My mom never made spaghetti sauce out of a jar. You know where we get our spaghetti sauce now? Here we are 20-some, almost 30 years later, out of a jar. And not just any jar, by the way, Bill, only from Kroger. It's the only kind we're allowed to use. Right? we make mistakes, and then we create adversarials because we're not patient and kind. We don't think about what we're saying, and we say unkind things, and then all of a sudden now we've got this rivalry. I'm just trying to give you real illustrations of real things that really happen, and hopes that maybe we'll avoid some of it and not put these in-laws and extended families in adversarial roles right off the bat that then create long-term problems. Let's be like Ruth, right? That's a beautiful story. A bell's rung. We don't have time to talk about it this morning. I'll come back for a few minutes Wednesday night. But what a beautiful story of how this can work. Jacob and Laban, horrible. Horrible example. Ruth and Naomi, and the situations that happen beyond, beautiful story of how it can work, and how with the right kind of patience, kindness, and love, it absolutely can work. We just have to choose, right? We have to choose what we want from that. Okay, so Lord willing, on Wednesday, I'll start there. We got a few more things, so be prepared to at least get into Lesson 3. I don't know that we will, but just in case, be ready to at least look at the first point or two in Lesson 3, as well as finishing up, Lord willing, Lesson 2 on Wednesday night. And I appreciate all your thoughts.